And hello, everyone. Happy New Year, happy spring, happy February, happy return to school. Welcome to Political Science 145, Ethnic Politics. My name, for those of you who are fortunate enough not to know me, is Dr. Michael Rossi, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and director of the International Relations Program. And I am absolutely thrilled that you are here with me as I am finally offering this class after more than a year of getting it on the books. And I sincerely hope that you enjoy the material and are ready to participate in what I think is going to be a really, really dynamic and engaging class. Now, for a number of you who probably already know, this class is part of a larger collection of courses that, beginning this spring, are part of a certificate in international relations, languages, and diplomacy, which is part of a very large grant that the Poli-Sci department received this past summer under the direction of my friend and colleague, Dr. Dalia Fahmy. And the certificate gives students the opportunity of taking a number of specifically designed courses that focus on, among other things, the relationship between language, communication, and diplomacy. And within the concept of language and communication, there obviously are a number of meanings, symbols, interpretations. So the grant is a 2-year grant that examines how language and communication conveys a set of meanings and understandings for one group, but because of translation problems, perceptions of how one understands a word or a phrase, they might be construed. Unfortunately misconstrued more so by others. So this is really an examination of sort of cultural approaches, sociological approaches to diplomacy, both formal at the places like the United Nations and in foreign embassies, as well as informal. The way in which we communicate with people on a day-to-day basis. And so I think that this class, Ethnic Politics, is certainly qualified for this type of pedagogy, considering that there's going to be a significant degree of culture, group identity, collective memory, and other narratives of group cohesion and differentiation that we're going to be examining, largely within the context of the United States. Now, as part of the certificate, there are a number of additional courses offered through the political science and social sciences and other liberal arts departments in Connolly College. Some of you may already be enrolled in the flagship course, IR 135, which is listed as UN Theory, but I teach under the name of Introduction to the United Nations. And if you're in both of them, you really get a good sense of both formal and informal diplomacy, language, and communication. The idea with this certificate is to give students the opportunity of earning at least 15 credits, which is 5 courses at the minimum, which will give you a certificate to add to your existing major. It also goes on to your diploma. And it makes you stand out, especially if you are looking for internships, going out on the job market. People have asked me if this is equivalent to a formal minor. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that if we understand minors to simply be customizations of major degrees of education, then this is what the certificate is. But does it count as a minor on one's transcript? And unfortunately, the answer is no. But as someone who has been, out of undergrad now for, more than enough years here, the picking up of a minor or a certificate or some kind of customization of what you are majoring in will add, regardless of what title you want to give it, sort of add a nuanced and rather unique approach to how you understand the subject. So the certificate will go great if you are a political science major, psychology major. We have some students that are looking into it from the pharmacy school, the business school. And so what's really nice about the certificate is that you don't have to worry about taking core courses in order to qualify for that minor. So with the list of courses that have been, spread throughout emails over the past couple of, weeks and months here, along with what we will be offering in the fall and the following spring, all of you who are interested in this are certainly well positioned to earn the certificate, maybe even as early as this coming fall. So that's just a little quick shout out to the certificate, and if anybody is interested in learning a little bit more about it, if you haven't heard of it already, feel free to speak with me. I am the co-project manager of this certificate along with my colleague, Dr. Fahmy. All right, so with that said, welcome to Ethnic Politics. Welcome to a rather interesting course because it is, if anything, an examination of the relationship between ethnicity and culture as forms of collective political identity. And, even if you're not really all that big on international politics and you're not really caught up on, let's say, global conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians or Russians and Ukrainians, Serbs and Albanians, groups like that here. What we will be looking at primarily in this class is the examination of ethnicity and culture within the United States. And I think that, certainly the last year, or last presidential administration has certainly given us more than enough material to look at. And so by looking at the relationship between ethnicity and culture as forms of collective political identity, we will be discussing the formation of beliefs, values, and preferences. Now, this is something that I always love discussing because one of my big interests in political science is asking a number of broad-based questions that, upon hearing, people probably would like to know the answers to. Like, why do people do the things that they do, right? Why do people fight for the things they fight for? Why do they oppose the things that they oppose? Why do groups vote for the people that they vote for, support the parties that they support? All of this falls into that first question. Why do people do the things that they do? Why do groups do the things that they do? And to answer that question, we almost invariably have to look at cultural attitudes, preferences, beliefs, values, right? What makes someone feel the way that they do politically? What makes someone a diehard supporter of Donald Trump? What makes someone giddy with glee that we now have the first female vice president, right? Forget her politics. Forget her history. It doesn't matter. We've got a female vice president. Brunch is nigh. What makes people still look at this and say, well, that doesn't really do anything for me? What about socioeconomic problems of the poor? When am I going to get my $2,000 stimulus check? Hey, how about you forgive some of my student debt? In fact, maybe all of it while we're at it. So why do people take the issues that they do? And, I know that I'm speaking to largely a group of political scientists. I also have a good group of psychology majors in this class, and you are all well positioned to be active and constructive members of class. I absolutely welcome all of the psych majors that are taking this class, and so you're all in a good position to kind of think to yourselves, well, you all have viewpoints. You all kind of believe in certain things, sometimes very adamantly. Why? Right? Why do you do that? Do you come to these beliefs yourself? Is it part of a larger group that you are a member of? Religious groups, cultural groups, ethnic groups, linguistic groups? And how do you communicate with your fellow group members about these ideas and trends and values and beliefs? So, as part of the certificate in language and diplomacy, right, this class recognizes the role of language as a vehicle for both meaning and communication. And especially if you are bilingual, right? There's a very good chance that being comfortable in another language, in fact, sometimes being fluent in another language, involves words and phrases and understandings that carry different meanings from that of English, right? I'm sure that if you're all, bilingual, trilingual in this case, you realize that you can't just simply Google translate something from Spanish to English or German to English or Russian to English and expect the same meaning to come out. For those of you who have had me in the past, especially in my politics and culture class, you know that within English, and even more so within, let's say, the New York metropolitan area English, right, we all have a number of phrases and colloquials that we say to each other that if you were to examine the words themselves, they mean something completely different than what we understand it to be. So, for example, when we want to say that something is real easy or no problem, we say it's a piece of cake. And if someone doesn't know that saying, oh, it's a piece of cake means that it's real easy, I'll get it done, people might be wondering, why is dessert products being entered into this conversation? And where is this cake? I would like to have some, And I'm sure that there are, words and phrases and colloquials in other languages as well. So, beyond just something as simple and as innocuous as slang, obviously the role of language is very important in the construction of not only ethnic identity, but cultural affirmations as well. So in this sense, this class will look at the use of ethnicity as a cultural tool for political activity. So I once again say that if you have a psychology or a sociology background, you're well versed for at least the first half of the material. But then what we do in political science, and those of you who know me know that, I'm definitely the qualitative wonk. So I don't really work in regression analyses or statistical charts and any of that kind of stuff, right? I like to hang out with the historians, the anthropologists, and the sociologists, and I listen to what they have to say, and then I try to concoct an argument. Some kind of purpose around that. And, some of them kind of look at me and say, you're looting the discipline. I'm like, well, that's what political science does. But when I say that we will be using ethnicity as a cultural tool for political activity, I'm hereby saying that it's more than just simply identifying as an ethnic whatever. An ethnic constituent, an ethnic group, an ethnic demograph, right? But that ethnicity, especially in the United States, is used not just by the group members, but is seen by non-group members, socio-political actors, as a cultural tool for political activity, right? You might remember about a year ago, people were talking about the black vote, the Latino vote, the Asian vote, right? As if these are monolithic voters, as if they all kind of think the same. And while it is very problematic to think that there is a monolithic black vote, there are a number of assumptions, unfortunately also stereotypes, that go into thinking about how a group will act, think, feel, and behave. And so, with all of that said, I have to say, this is an absolute perfect time to be taking this class. In fact, I'm almost thankful that it took me this long to finally get the class up and running, because we are going to effectively be looking at really the last 4 years of the Donald Trump era. And here I am recording this lecture at the very end of January. We're about a week and a half in to a brand new presidency under Joe Biden. And I think it's fair enough to say that 2020 was, well, it was a lot of things. One thing it definitely wasn't was boring. Let's put it that way. Here we are, brand new year, brand new president, and we have gone through a number of unexpected challenges and, tribulations. We are living in a country now where a number of extremist organizations have been empowered, have been mobilized. It's not to say that they began under the Trump era, but they certainly felt emboldened under Trump's leadership. And I am recording this lecture within the very same month that there was a literal assault on the Capitol in D.C. Now, whether you want to refer to it as a coup or what I like to just refer to it as managed chaos for social media, it took a number of people by surprise. I don't know if any of you were watching the news as it was unfolding, right? But people were just absolutely shocked to see thousands of people, many of them just vehemently angry and looking for blood, against, elected officials over what they honestly felt was, a subversion of democracy with Trump's electoral defeat. And so by taking this class in early 2021, we are able to note the radicalization of marginalized socioeconomic and socio-political communities, the likes of which, we hadn't really seen 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm not just simply talking about the alt-right. Right? I'm not talking about just the crazy white supremacists. I'm also talking about the idea that over the past 5 years or so, the status quo, the political status quo in this country has been, I think, significantly under attack. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. What we have found pretty much since late 2015, early 2016, is that there is a vast majority of Americans on both the political right and the political left that are unhappy with a neoliberal status quo, a status quo that is not addressing many of the pressing socio-political and socioeconomic issues of the day, especially when it comes to things like healthcare, student debt relief, climate addressing, and other issues, right? The understanding that our current leadership is trying to, at best, bring back a sense of normalcy by restoring the status quo of the Obama era, I don't think is going to make a whole bunch of people really happy here, especially when identity politics is unraveling in a declining neoliberal world. And what I mean by this is what we have previously just simply taken as granted in American political culture, the ideology of neoliberalism, sort of this understanding that the free market will solve most, if not all, of your problems. The idea that self-improvement and self-empowerment comes largely through the acquisition of material goods. And the idea that self-gratification is a fantastic way of dealing with institutional and systemic depression. And what we find increasingly is that this is not being accepted by an increasing majority of Americans, especially people who are 35 and under. Right? Now, I've been at LIU now for almost 2 years. I worked at Rutgers University for well more than 15. And I can tell you this much right now. Undergrad students are right to be worried, to be anxious, to be pessimistic about the future. They're right to wonder, where am I going to go and what am I going to do after I graduate? What is my degree going to do? Will I be able to find a job that will provide financial support for me while I still have to pay off student debts and other, economic, problems and obligations? And so what we are looking at right now in 2021 is not just the unraveling of identity politics in a declining neoliberal world, but a reorientation of that identity around class and political alignment. This, I think, explains more than anything else the phenomenon of the left progressive movement, where people are now identifying not so much by their skin color or their religion, if they have one at all, but by their level of income, but by their perceived economic mobility, which explains the phenomenon of the Bernie Sanders movement. But at the same time, folks, we are also looking at an America that no longer has a monopoly on state-sponsored historical memory. In other words, if the neoliberal world is declining, if people are less and less likely to believe that hard work and dedication will get you that job, that will allow you to live fine, right? And if you realize that the American dream is out of your reach, then it doesn't matter what our elected officials tell us. It really doesn't matter how emphatic people can, want you to believe in unity and healing, right? There's a certain level, there's a certain degree of political actors in the United States that desperately want you to believe that, we as America can do better, that we're a better people, this is not us, and if we just all get along, everything will be fine. And that might sound great if you're a home-owning suburban dweller who doesn't have to worry about whether or not they're going to lose their job next week. What we find increasingly for people who are unmoored by this idea of American exceptionalism is that people are searching for answers. People are looking for different explanations for why the country is the way that it is, where it may go in the near future, and who are the culprits? Who are the people that are responsible for deferring this, so-called American dream? And many people are searching for answers not through official channels of communication, through, let's say, the mainstream media or newspapers or whatever, but they're looking online. They're looking, into different chat sites and Facebook groups and Twitter accounts and Reddit sub-posts. There is the explosion of conspiracy movements, chief of which we all know right now is, QAnon. There is a veritable renaissance in new left readings. Younger students, first I've seen in a long time, are, effectively rereading the writings and the articles and the books of Marx and Engels. They're rereading Antonio Gramsci. They're rediscovering economic practitioners like Kautsky and Karl Polanyi. I mean, these are things that I can tell you this much: 5-10 years ago, none of you would even think of doing. But what is also apparent in this democratization of information is that identity politics, which is, sort of becoming formless before it reforms into something else, is taking on rather, macro-structural things like ethnicity, identity, religion, language, and whatnot, and sort of creating these new narratives about, what the black community should be doing, what the Latino community should be doing, what the white community needs to safeguard, right? And with all of these YouTube channels and podcasts and talk radios and, other, types of forms of what I will just euphemistically call underground journalism, right? People are finding new sets of group identities that create a type of collective identity for each other that pits themselves against others, right? And less are people relying on the more official articles and essays and opinion pieces of the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN. Don't get me wrong. They're all still there, and they're all still going to be writing. But, if you have, let's say, glanced at, an opinion piece, an editorial piece in the New York Times, the op-ed section, and you kind of look at some of the positions that many of these, I have to say, privileged journalists are writing, you almost have to envy their salary and their level of income, because it takes a certain degree of financial security to be that optimistic about the returning status quo of the United States today. So the point I'm trying to make here is that this is a perfect time to be taking this class because politics are becoming raw again. The idea of ethnicity and culture is no longer being assumed that one group votes for that group of people and the other group votes for that. In the last presidential election, Trump's voting bloc among minorities increased from that of 2016. So the Democratic Party can no longer simply take the black, Latino, and Asian votes for granted anymore. The voting base that saved Biden, that saved the Democratic Party and put Biden in power, white suburban dwellers. Right? White suburban dwellers abandoned Trump and voted for Biden. And at the same time, Trump's voting percentage increased among minorities. So it's no longer, as I just said, it is no longer assumed that people of color will just march in step with the Democratic Party. And with all of that, if you're ready to rock and roll, let's begin. And even though this is still the first introductory lecture, I want to just kind of give you an overview of really what are some of the more broader-based subjects and concepts that we will be discussing. And a great way to begin, besides beginning with this awesome painting of Trump and Melania, I'll discuss the painting and the painter in class this coming week, is to look at a number of opening questions, which I will also ask this coming week. And if you're watching this video before the semester formally begins, well, this is a great opportunity for you to maybe start jotting down some ideas. So when we come to class on Monday, you're a little bit more prepared and you can kind of, jot out and map out some of your thoughts. How is ethnicity understood as a form of cultural identity? I mean, in a way, this is kind of what this class is aiming to help address. But what do you think is the relationship between culture and ethnicity? Right? How is it that, especially if you identify with a particular ethnic group, and to be perfectly honest, everybody can identify with an ethnic group. It doesn't matter if you're like 3-4 generations of whiteness into this country. You all come from something. It's a little bit easier for people who are first generation, who are still bilingual and speak to their parents in their native tongue for you to identify as ethnic. But in a way, there isn't not ethnicity, right? And I think that definitely plays out when culture is involved. So what are the things that, let's say, your family does during the holidays? How did you celebrate Christmas, or New Year's, or Hanukkah, or Ramadan, or something like that, right? What foods do you eat? What commemorations do you participate in? What holidays do you celebrate? Which other ones do you just kind of, forget by the wayside? And how does being part of an ethnic group, how does being part of an ethnic identity lead into the culture that you possess or that you try to uphold and safeguard, especially if you feel like you owe it to your parents or grandparents to keep certain traditions alive? Now, at the opposite end of the spectrum, let me ask a second question. Do you think ethnicity is a social construct? Is there something that is primordial about, Latino ethnicity? German, Italian, Irish, Russian, Kenyan ethnicity? Is ethnic identity something that we are just born into and there's nothing that we can do about it? Or is it something that we can change? And this is probably something that the psychology students might be able to address a little bit more than the political scientists. Not to say the poli-scis are unqualified, but the psychology students, the anthropology students look a little bit more into this idea of constructed identities. But let's just say, is black identity in the United States something that is inherent? Or is it a product of socio-political and socio-economic circumstances? And, can one, and this is getting really metaphysical here, can one somehow leave one ethnicity and be part of another, right? That's not to say that all of a sudden, if you're white, you decide to identify as black. All right, we're not going there. But, can you, let's say, identify, if we understand ethnicity to not just be, let's say, racial, could it be class-based, right? Could, let's say, this is an idea that just immediately comes to mind, and this might be a little outdated for some of you, but guess what? I'm going ahead with it. I am a big fan of The Sopranos. I don't know if you remember that show that was on TV a number of years ago. Pretty close to pretty close to authenticity as far as North New Jersey organized crime is concerned. And there was this episode, I forget which season it was, But, Tony and his family are part of that, old school, urban-based, working-class Italian identity. And that, of course, is reinforced by the job that Tony has and the mafia connections that he runs. But his Italian neighbors, literally the neighbors next door, the Cusamanos, are part of the professional class, right? Dr. Cusimano, is a doctor. His wife, Jeannie Cusimano, is a lawyer. And while Cusimanos and Sopranos are both, inherently Italian, the two of them have completely different outlooks on life, right? And there was this, part of the episode where Tony is talking to his, group about the Cusimanos and saying that they stopped being Italian. They became American, right? They became American, right? They kind of leveled up. They wasped up. Whereas Tony and his crew, who still, deal with more blue-collar type of professions, maintain their Italian heritage. So in other words, it's sort of like, if you were kind of like born into a working-class identity, but you somehow ascend the ladder to, I don't know, move from Bay Ridge to Brooklyn Heights, does your ethnicity change? Is it a social construct? Can you somehow think and act differently, right? And, if the answer to all of this is gravitating more towards yes than no, well, now we've got something to talk about here. Because if that's the case, then ethnicity and ethnic identity take on political potency, right? Now, all of a sudden, ethnicity not just is a social construct, but it's a social construct that can be used for political purposes. And it doesn't necessarily have to be devious, right? But it's something that is just harnessed into the larger network of studies on political culture. Hence the whole understanding of black politics and the internal struggle between, let's say, Cornel West and Nina Turner on one side, and Jim Clyburn and Kamala Harris and Barack Obama on the other, right? Should black politics remain the politics of the subordinate and the one that resists, let's say, the pressures of neoliberal capitalism? Or should one ascend the ladder and become part of that system without any kind of racial divide? What about white identity? This is something that people are, I think, rather hesitant to touch upon because they don't want to, run too close to sounding like, a white supremacist or a white apologist. But look, this class is going to address one of the big issues, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that is white identity is used, has been successfully used, and will continue to be used as a tool of political mobility and political action. White identity, upper class, white identity, lower class. How is this used within the political process? And then, of course, we have the very euphemistically lumped in Latino voter, which is a problematic term in and of itself because it assumes that anyone that has some ethnicity south of the Rio Grande is the same. I'm going to be honest with you, the idea of the Latino voter is itself a social construct. Because within the family of Latino voters, you've got Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans, Panamanians, Costa Ricans, Venezuelans, Argentinians, Brazilians, what have you. But within mainstream newspapers, it's just simply the Latino vote, which more often than not, I hate to say this, is just kind of assumed to just euphemistically be Mexican. Except if we're talking about Miami, which then, of course, is Cuban. But even there, right, we're talking about Cuban expats that are virulently anti-Castro, in favor of regime change in Havana. I mean, that in and of itself is also a very specific voting base. But it's all lumped in to a group of people, right? So the idea is that is there, a monolithic understanding of black politics? Is there a single way of understanding white identity? Can we continue to just euphemistically say the Latino voter? Because depending upon, again, social class, location, and also heritage from the old country, right? There is a vast difference between Puerto Rican Americans and Cuban Americans and Mexican Americans and anybody from Central America on south, right? Now, you may just be able to say they all speak Spanish and they're largely, I'm going to, bet more so than not that they're Catholic. But the Latino voters can be, on one level, very much in favor of working class progressive values, but are also, for the most part, rather conservative on the social and the moral sense. So where does the Latino voter fit? The Republican camp, the Democratic camp? One thing that we noted in the last year or so is that the Sanders movement was phenomenally successful with the Latino voter, which, tapped into the idea that the quote-unquote Latino voter has a significant amount of working class identity and doesn't care about the language per se, doesn't care about the heritage, but cares about their place on the socioeconomic pecking order. And more often than not, right, these are union workers, these are exploited workers, and these are people that were previously taken for granted and assumed to fall into one or two categories by Democrats or Republicans. So think of some of these questions. If you're listening before Monday, I'm going to be asking this in class, and I'd like to see what your input is. Now, why is all this stuff important? Now, it's like, okay, why devote an entire class to ethnicity and politics, right? Couldn't we just bang this out in 2 weeks? Well, maybe if this was an introductory survey class, but I have my reasons. Chief of which is I love this stuff, and they asked me to teach it, so that's what I need to do. But more specifically, to get a little bit more serious here, there are some very important points to note. Both ethnicity and culture are socially constructed forms of identity that embody certain beliefs, behaviors, identities, and values. Okay? So yes, both ethnicity and culture are constructs, right? They do not exist in the nether world, okay? They are man-made forms of identity. And while that may get you to believe, okay, well then they're fabricated, they can be unmade. The important thing to note here is that these constructs are largely shaped by institutional and economic circumstances, which in turn shapes and directs ideas, values, beliefs, and principles to either empower or disenfranchise authority. Now, this is very important to note here, because what this implies is the interworking relationship between culture, institutions, and economic resources. So if we are to assume that both ethnicity and the larger concept of culture are socially constructed phenomena, they are not just constructed out of nowhere. Okay? They are constructed within a series of exposures, experiences, limits, benefits, stimuli, pressures, grievances, what have you, that are in turn shaped by political and economic circumstances. And so that construct then disseminates and projects a certain set of ideas, values, beliefs, and principles. So to kind of simplify this, if a significant amount of black politics is the social construct around economic exploitation, political racism, and the idea that aside from the indigenous populations of this country, no group as a collective whole has been as systemically pressed down and discriminated against, more so, than the African American community, then it stands to reason that African American identity is going to be based on that concept of being discriminated. It is going to understand that to be black is to take a certain degree of precaution that whites and others would not make. And especially, right, in the era of the Black Lives Matter movement, okay, there is an increased sense of precaution among blacks that if they happen to be stopped by the police, there is a greater probability that they are going to be harassed than whites. So you take that already into account. So if the NYPD stops you, you're far more on the defensive than if the NYPD were to stop me in the subway, some white dude from New Jersey, right? I would probably walk up to him and say, "Yes, sir, officer, can I help you? What's the matter?" And it's like, if you're black and an NYPD officer stops you, you're like, "Oh, dear God, what now?" I'm not saying that that's a guarantee, but I'm saying it's a hell of a lot more likely. And so with that, it is important to note that it is difficult. It is extremely difficult to separate politics from ethnicity and culture from collective action. So yes, even if ethnicity and culture are social constructs, this is a social construct that has been made and remade in a constant dialectic between exogenous stimuli and collective beliefs. So consider the Black Lives Matter movement, which didn't just sprout out of nowhere, right? But it really is a culmination of months, years, some would even go so far as to say decades, of finally reacting to the idea that simply being born with a particular skin color is going to put you at a significant political, social, and economic disadvantage, right? Full stop. Full stop. And then consider the response among some whites to the Black Lives Matter movement, the whole All Lives Matter response. And the All Lives Matter movement, which, let's go back to the concept of language and communication. If you have no idea about the action and reaction among cultural politics in this country, especially between whites and blacks over the past at least century, if not more so, you would think the All Lives Matter is, oh, isn't that inclusive? Oh, that's so wonderful. That's right, all lives matter, because Black lives matter, white lives matter, brown lives matter, all lives matter, right? But to the observer, and the one that knows that there's a greater tendency of people who spout all lives matter to basically be white, conservative, and it's a response that doesn't so much include the blacks, but just simply is a better way of saying, look, why should you be more privileged than anyone else, right? And that narrative that comes out that I had just said, well, what makes you so special? Why don't people care about white lives? We already know that the argument is never going to reach some kind of modicum of agreement, right? Because usually the ones that say, all lives matter, why can't we be as just as sensitive to white lives, tend to come from people who aren't necessarily persecuted or discriminated against. They might think of themselves at the absolute worst as being oppressed by affirmative action, okay? But that's a far cry from having a greater likelihood of being murdered by the police simply because you're black. So the All Lives Matter movement might sound inclusive, but it is a deliberate reaction, an opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement. And then when we take in the Blue Lives Matter movement, which is even more oppositional, even less interested in inclusivity, we end up realizing that there's a certain type of people. And again, I'm not going to be passing judgment on myself right here, but there's people who think, if you go that far in the era of Black Lives Matter, in the era of, at least once a month, a black person is killed by the police, and you go out of your way to go back the blue, support police lives because their lives are important. It's like, no. Police lives is not an ethnicity. You choose to enter that life, okay? But the fact that you are saying that also means that you are somehow opposed to Black Lives Matter. So ethnicity and culture, right, can very much lead to conflict as well. And so this class will not be shy in examining, not just the role of ethnic conflict, but asking, what are they fighting about? Why are they fighting about it? Why is it that competing groups in some areas fight more than others, right? What's the reason here? Why is it that things are much more violent between one group and another? And in another situation, you have two competing groups, but the opportunity for violence and conflict isn't as prone. Are these problems that they're fighting over solvable or intractable? And especially within, like, let's say the last 2 weeks of the Biden administration, where, a whole bunch of, I have to say, relatively privileged individuals are saying, now's the time for unity, now's the time for compromise, now's the time that we have to reach across the aisle and work with people that we otherwise don't agree with. People who say that oftentimes live in neighborhoods where there really isn't any conflict. And those that are in conflict-prone areas are like, I am not going to cooperate with somebody who basically gets up every morning and tries to figure out how they can kill me. And you don't negotiate with extremists in that sense. So how are politics used to exacerbate or mitigate the conflict? Because, folks, I hate to break it to you, ethnic conflict does not exist simply because one ethnicity is in the presence of another, right? It's not that whites and blacks are going to fight, Latinos and whites, or Latinos and blacks are going to fight, or Asians. And it's not like you put two people in a subway car and they're going to get into a fist fight. No, it doesn't happen like that. Conflict arises through either the perpetuation of conflict or the failure of groups trying to find middle ground, trying to find some solution in moving forward. So yes, the relationship between ethnicity and culture is very important to understand really why things are the way that they are in the United States and elsewhere. Okay? So this relationship between ethnicity and culture is something that we need to really, nail down as quickly as possible, because the role of culture in shaping and directing ethnic identity really falls into two things. And this is something that we're going to be discussing in greater specifics on Wednesday. The first is the formation of what we call group identity. Okay, group identity. And write this down because this is a important vocab word here. Group identity is a collective process that connects individuals to groups and defines shared worldviews and interests. And this connectivity between the individual and the group is oftentimes articulated through and contested around, right, everyday practices like commemorations, symbols, language, food, clothing, religion, monuments, and collective memories that connect the present with the past. So, for instance, if you happen to identify with a particular ethnic group, it doesn't have to be, it could be anything, right? The fact that you identify with that is largely because, let's say, your parents were that, you came from the country, whatever it happens to be, right? But even there, you will identify with the group, and you will, you will take part in its collective joy when accomplishments are made, even though you didn't do anything with those accomplishments. You will take sadness when the group experiences a defeat, even though you weren't there to either be responsible for that defeat or prevent that defeat. You will get angry over something that the group experienced years ago, maybe even before you were even born, right? So, like a couple of days ago was Holocaust Remembrance Day. And, if you are, 18 to 21 years old and Jewish today, you'd have no connection to the Holocaust whatsoever, but you feel that this is important for your identity because of what happened to your group about 70, 80 years ago. And that's just not necessarily for Jews. If you're Armenian, you will identify with and get emotionally attached to the narratives of the Armenian genocide, even though that happened more than 100 years ago. And with this, we get to the second element of ethnicity and culture. And that is group identity is oftentimes then connected not just through these day-to-day tangible variables, but they are all somehow subsumed within the idea of collective narratives, right? Narratives that groups use for identifying in-group members from external actors. Narrative is another incredibly important term that we will be using in this class, because narratives form a large part of ethnic group identity through the production of stories and memories, right? Narratives are a way for a group to remember their collective past, shape their present activities with memories of the past, and also chart possible avenues for progress in the future, okay? And these narratives, these stories, these memories, right? This is where things get really interesting, and the psychologists in class are going to have a field day with this one. These narratives are taken as non-negotiable by the group. It doesn't matter if the narrative and the selective remembering of the past might be different from what actually happened, right? The historian can go in and say, well, that's not actually what happened. What actually happened is this. The groups will be like, screw you, right? That's who cares about that? This is how we think about it, right? And this is where, more often than not, half the political scientists will run in the opposite direction, because for them, culture just gets in the way of real, empirical research. Hey, culture is what makes us who we are. Culture is the stuff that makes us unique. And yeah, culture can be really annoying at times. But guess what? That's the reality. That's what people do. That's how people think. And if you want to be able to somehow mitigate problems of ethnic conflict, you can't just simply sit them down, at the UN and have some Scandinavian write out some terms and conditions for consociationalism. No wonder nobody takes us seriously. You got to look at the narratives. You got to look at what are they fighting for? What gets one group of people to put down whatever it is that they're doing, take up a gun and defend something to the death? Okay? Like, what makes someone rationally choose to act irrational? And they don't care, right? They don't care. That's the stuff that ethnic politics is rooted in. So even if these narratives are selective rememberings of past events, they are taken as gospel by that group. And that may very well be the reason why, right, one group constantly fights with another. So group identity, right, if we were to sort of take just some rudimentary ideas of what we already know, group identity is oftentimes translated into group goals and interests that are inevitably represented through political movements and institutions. So it's not enough for just simply the group to just sit there every day and just be like, yeah, this is who we are, this is what we believe, and this is what we don't believe. But oftentimes this stuff is translated into some kind of collective political action. Some groups will form their own political parties, and we find this, definitely in many multi-ethnic states around the world, where politics and ethnicity are, the Venn diagram is one circle, basically. So it will either be in the formation of formal political parties that cater to and often appropriate, right, these interests for their own agenda. So within the United States, at the risk of, being too general, right, the Republican Party, I would say, since 2008, since Barack Obama's election, has taken it upon itself to be the political mantle for whiteness, right? Just all sorts of whiteness, rich, middle class, poor, the white party. And that's not necessarily the case, right? There's a lot of people of color that vote Republicans, but, the mantra is like the Republican Party is the party of the white guy, okay? And the Democrats, on the other hand, are the party of multiculturalism. Right? We're the party, remember Biden's statement a couple of months ago, right? If you don't vote for me, you ain't black. And it's just like, again, this is before the party told him, just go into the basement and we'll, write your speeches for you, right? The idea that there could be no possible way for a black or a Latino to vote for Trump. How could you possibly vote for him? He's a racist, right? And I personally know African Americans and Latinos that voted for Trump. And they're like, this, it's unsettling, but at the same time, he makes me money, Or how many Latinos do you know that are like, yeah, build that wall. I don't want any of us coming in anymore. I came in legally. Why are these people got to hop the fence, swim the river? Screw them. Right? There is, to assume that that the Democrats will take everybody else is, equally problematic. But the idea is, right, group identity is something that can be used and, I have to say, abused by many political actors. And, if these ethnic groups possess narratives of identity, these narratives are, regardless of, objectivity, things that will position the group as a socio-political component of a larger community of citizens. So, as I had mentioned before about, let's say, black narratives of oppression and subordination, groups will look at themselves within the larger construct of, let's say, the United States, right? The black identity, the Latino identity, the Asian, the white identity, just being very, very, very macro structural here. And these narratives will take on ideas of either subordination or domination, right? And then within, let's say, white politics, the idea that even if you specifically are poorer, working class, you ain't a hedge fund manager. You ain't part of the 1%, okay? You could totally stand for some good old-fashioned New Deal, social welfare policies. You will see yourself as someone who doesn't need a charity a handout because you're white and you should be entitled. You should be entitled to dominate over any kind of other imposed subordination that may actually be the result of things like affirmative action, political correctness, coastal elites who have, abandoned their, white roots and culture for globalization and multicultural tolerance and blah, 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 right? So yeah, we are going to be spending a good amount of time in this class not just looking at black politics, but also the political identities, the collective political identities of the rural white working class, and why they have pretty much to a T voted over the past 15 or so years, undeniably, for the Republican Party, even if it is against their socioeconomic interests. Right? So what does this say about culture? Right? What does this say about the whole phenomenon of culture? Well, a few things. Culture is a shared system of meaning that people use to make sense of the world and is something that is expressed in a wide variety of symbolic forms and commemorations. It's just a simple definition of what culture is. However, culture can be a lot of things, but one thing that I will tell you it is not. Culture is neither unified, and it is definitely not monolithic. Right? This is something that a lot of social scientists, especially political scientists that don't dabble in this stuff, tend to just simply assume. Hence the whole Latino voter. It's a big, there's not one voting block of a Latino voter. Or the white Trump voter, we like to just euphemistically think is some knuckle-dragging, lowbrow intellectual racist. Like, no. The white working class person who voted for Trump also, for the most part, did so because there's no allowable left-wing working class movement. Every time Bernie Sanders tries to get somewhere, the Democratic Party sabotages his movement. In a parallel universe, Bernie made the primary this past election, and the white working class voter would have been significantly divided between the union worker that just wants a better deal and the more racist nativist that will probably vote for Trump. So look, there may be non-negotiable truths that define group identity, hence the concept of narrative, right? But within that narrative, within that group, right, cultural variations and interpretations exist and are internally contested, right? Hence the, debate within the black community over who runs, who controls it, right? Again, Cornel West or Barack Obama. The two of them, Cornel West used to love Obama. Now he doesn't have a lot of nice things to say about him. He calls him a sellout in that regard, right? Within the Latino community, right? Do we go left? Do we go right? What's the deal here? So ethnicity is malleable fluid, interpretive, and debated. And this is good news, folks, because it means that if you're part of one ethnic group, it doesn't mean that you are perpetually damned to be subordinated, to be exploited, or to constantly be playing catch up to the woke white liberal in the affluent neighborhoods of New York and San Francisco. It also means that neither culture nor ethnicity are root causes of conflict. Also great news, right? Culture doesn't create conflict. Ethnicity does not create conflict. Rather, conflict is caused through narrative and even more so, political appropriation. So what does that mean in the simplest way? Is it people that exploit this stuff for political gain? Yeah. And we'll get more specific in the coming weeks. But the good news here is that culture itself is not inherently belligerent. Okay? So this leads us to draw a few points of departure at the start of this course, right? Yes, I'm reaching some preliminary hypotheses as we move forward. So that's why I wanted to put this lecture in video format here, just in case we run out of time on Monday. But you have it for, archival usage whenever you need it. 3 things we walk away from as we are about to begin this course. Number 1, ethnic culture is neither inherently progressive nor regressive. It is whatever socio-political actors make of it to use and, sadly, abuse. Again, this is good news because it means that ethnic identity is by itself whatever we make of it. Ethnic conflict is neither inherent nor inevitable between competing groups. Okay? Now, there might be people in this country that want you to believe whites and blacks are always going to be at odds, right? Or blacks and Latinos are going to team up to kick the whites out of certain, urban areas, certain, suburban places, what have you. And then, of course, we haven't even talked about the Muslim population yet, right? Wait till we get to them. Cultures can be inclusive or exclusive. And in some cases, culture can be both at the same time. Depending on the narrative, culture can be inclusive as well as exclusive. Finally, ethnic politics, what this class is titled, is conditioned around socio-political and socio-economic circumstances and conditions. So in that sense, culture, identity, and political culture are all shaped around prevailing environmental, structural conditions and constraints. Okay? So perceptions of inclusivity will reduce the ethnic character of group activity. And that doesn't necessarily mean inclusivity has to be affluence. Inclusivity can also be collective poverty, but everyone kind of helps each other out. This is the sort of the Marxist understanding of working class identity. It doesn't matter your skin color, your language, your ethnicity, your religion, right? You're all exploited by the man up above. And the man wants you to be divided along ethnic cleavages so they can sit there eating popcorn, watching all of you beat the crap out of each other. Whereas instead, if you all realize, hey, we form unions, we all form worker solidarity organizations, and we work together, white, black, brown, whatever, guess what? Ethnic politics, it's less ethnic and is simply more politics in that regard. Okay? At the other end of the spectrum, noted perceptions of discrimination, racism, apartheid, xenophobia, will force these groups into collective security and collective action. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it justifies groups forming these, sort of inclusive, garrisoned-like, exclusively oriented, garrisoned-like groups here. Right? It doesn't justify that, but it helps explain. It helps explain why whites became fearful of blacks beginning in the late 60s, or at least modern day, cultural conflict in the late 60s. The reason why blacks became collectively fearful of police officers, right? The reason why Muslims continue to congregate amongst themselves out of collective fear that everyone else thinks that they are fifth column agents ready to bring terrorism and jihad into the United States, right? So in this case, ethnic politics is, as I said, whatever we choose to put into it. And that, again, is good news, because it doesn't mean that cultural differences mean that people are perpetually fighting each other. So with that said, folks, welcome aboard. I hope that this opening lecture really gave you a sense of what we can talk about, what we can investigate, what we can discuss and share over the next 13 to 14 weeks. The readings might be, in some cases, a little more dense than others, but I really want you to, go through them. I think that I selected them to be as readable, as informative, and as enjoyable as possible. Okay? So with that said, we will pick up immediately with our first in-depth lecture that examines the readings by Cornel West, Mark Howard Ross, and David Layton. Now, I understand that it is still the first week, and I know that I'm, forcing you to, come charging out of the stands, in a full sprint. The readings for this week are critically important for us moving forward. So again, if you're listening to this lecture before the semester begins, or you've already visited Blackboard and have been able to obtain those readings, definitely try to come to class on Wednesday with them read. And even if you don't get half of the material, the accompanying lecture will help flesh all that stuff out. So begin with Cornel West, move to Mark Howard Ross, and then finish up with David Layton. If you look at the syllabus, I've emphasized the certain pages that I want you to read in Layton. Have all that stuff read, we will be ready to have a fantastic discussion beginning this coming Wednesday. And then we will be able to move into the following week through an examination of narrative. All right, if there are any questions about class, about the material, and about the larger certificate that I mentioned in the beginning of the lecture, feel free to contact me whenever, or you can speak with me at the beginning or end of class on Monday. But welcome aboard. I hope that I got you excited about this material. I am really looking forward to offering this class, and I sincerely hope that you enjoy our time together.